All right, welcome back. Another week, another book. This week, we've been reading Discovery of the Mind, Part 2. Walter Kaufmann again, 3 volumes. This is Volume 2, Discovering the Mind. In it, he's discussing Nietzsche, Heidegger, and a philosopher called Martin Buber, who I'd never heard of before, funnily enough. And most of it is attributed to Nietzsche. He was an admirer of Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is very much the hero of the book, of this volume, but probably of the entire book, I'd say. And Kaufmann was a great scholar of Nietzsche. He translated a lot of Nietzsche's work into English, and he's widely regarded as one of Nietzsche's best translators. And the reason for that is because he follows Martin Buber's method of translation, which is to really try and get at the heart of what the author is trying to say. And so he took great pains to really understand Nietzsche's philosophy, and he managed to translate it, and they are really quite wonderful, the Nietzsche translations. So if you have read Nietzsche and haven't read the Kaufmann translations, give them a go. And if you haven't read Nietzsche, definitely start with the Kaufmann translations because they're quite good. So there you have it. The book starts with Nietzsche, and he discusses Nietzsche's contributions to the discovery of the mind. Now, remember, the mind is the entire human experience and not just in a dualistic sense that separates mind from body. The mind is all of our experience, thoughts, feelings, emotions, the what it is like to be human, what the human experience is really like, and as it arises up in front of us in consciousness. That's how he conceptualized the mind, and he discusses Nietzsche's contributions to it. He believes Nietzsche was the most profound in that sense, and interesting, a lot of German philosophers came at philosophy steeped in Kant, and what that means is they were trained in philosophy, and the philosophical tradition in Germany didn't begin with Kant, but it was highly influenced by Kant, as we saw in the last episode I did with Volume 1. He talks about Kant, and Kant influenced philosophy quite profoundly in Germany. So Nietzsche didn't start as a philosopher; he started as a philologist, and he was brought up reading Goethe. Funnily enough, very interesting. He was steeped in Goethe, and as it's been mentioned, at the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy, you find Goethe and not Kant. And that's interesting. So what did Nietzsche actually say? Well, his first claim was about consciousness. And he claimed that consciousness was just a veil. And what he meant by that is that it merely lied at the surface of our experience and wasn't what's really at the heart of it, which he believed was a lot of subconscious processes. Now, in many ways, Nietzsche anticipated Freud in that sense, and a lot of analytical psychology, because he really took great pains, Nietzsche that is, to analyze himself and investigate the goings-on of his own psyche. And eventually he went mad. He had severe headaches frequently and could only read and write for a couple of hours a day towards the end of his life. And perhaps that's the trade-off for greatness. Who knows? But in his claim, consciousness is merely the veil. The what it is like to be human, the experience that we have, it's a private experience. Nobody else can observe the what it is like to be me. That's something only I can experience. And the way I experience it is similar to others because we're all human, but it's impossible to really know that it is exactly the same. And that's because there's no measure of it. There's no way to measure the human experience. There's ways to measure brain activity and the way the brain responds to certain phenomena that occur in the external world, but no way to really measure the stream of consciousness that occurs within us. And so, me, as I'm talking to you, I'm situated in a position and I am directing my experience towards the camera. It's in the framework of a story that I've told. I'm relaying to you a book that I've read. And you, if you're watching, you're observing that through a window of your own consciousness. You're observing an external event and you're internalizing it. You're thinking about it in interesting ways. And so that's a very cursory and basic definition of the experience, the human experience. Things occur in the world and we interpret it and we think about it. And it's unique. So Nietzsche wants to say that that is simply a surface level goings on that's occurring within the stream of human consciousness. The real meat of it is happening at subconscious levels. There are certain um, qualia, which is like phenomena, that's occurring that you will be interpreting or observing without really realizing it, and those things will be contributing to your experience. There are certain emotions that are encompassing us always that influence the way we see the world. Perhaps we're in mild forms of discomfort about something in our life, and that discomfort will arise in ways that we don't fully understand as we walk amongst the world. Sometimes things will occur in the external world which will trigger such discomfort. It will lay a hand on the real heart of what's going on subconsciously, and a visceral emotion will arise as a response to it that perhaps we ourselves weren't even prepared for. That's the very interesting thing about it. And so, if this sounds similar to psychoanalytic theory, that's because it is. And Nietzsche was writing about this stuff, 20 years before Freud ever came along. And, Freud was steeped in Nietzsche, which is very interesting. And so he makes the claim that certainly there are events that arise in the world that impact us and cause us to have dreams. And very often we'll seek a cause in our living experience, which we want to label as the cause of that dream. And the depth of that will depend on the individual. But the point is that even though we can concede that happens in the dream world, that's happening as well in our state of consciousness. The stream of human experience is happening precisely the same way, where these certain phenomena are arising that may not necessarily be the center of our direction or our attention, but nevertheless is impacting us in ways that we're not aware of. And that will cause and impact certain emotions, thoughts, feelings, beliefs that arise during the course of our life. And it's quite profound. Now, so Kaufmann is taking it from a psychological standpoint that Nietzsche really impacted psychology in ways that hadn't been done before. He saw the world in very, very profound ways, and he was self-analytical. He was consistently thinking about his experience and his way of approaching the world and how he moved about it and what that meant. He was trying to interpret it and build a philosophy of that interpretation for all of us. And he did quite well. But a lot of it's bracketed and not obscure, but it takes a lot of work. I don't fully understand him. I've read him a few times. I've read most of his books and multiple times, and I still don't fully understand everything that he has to share. And that's often the mark of a true genius, I feel, when each time you reach into the book, it tells you something new. And that's definitely the case with Nietzsche. So do have a go. Now, that was his contribution to psychology. He also talked about power. And we need to be careful here because power can be misconstrued, and it very often is misconstrued as inherently evil. And that's not how Nietzsche saw it. Now, he made the claim himself that he philosophizes with a hammer. And some have come to interpret that, and some have come to willfully misinterpret that as philosophizing with a sledgehammer, where you assert some theory in a authoritarian way, and it's not up for debate or discussion. Your view of the world is final and complete, and all one needs is to adhere to that and they will be satisfied or at least understand the correct view of the world. No, that's not how Nietzsche saw it at all. And when he described what he meant, he described it as if you have some sort of hammer that's quite precise and you're tapping onto something hollow and you're waiting and you're closely listening for a response or a reverberation that arises from the impact. So you put something out into the world and then you listen attentively and you wait for the world to respond back. And that's what he meant by philosophizing with a hammer. It's a very diligent and careful process and not a power-hungry authoritarian one that is often attributed to him. So he discusses the will to power, and here we go. Power is, for Nietzsche, one of the primary motivators for life. And it's not survival, as some scholars will like to proffer, that it's purely a survival mechanism, our existence. It's just experience in, reaction out, all based on survival. Whatever's going to prolong my longevity. And usually that, from an evolutionary perspective, that means having children, right? Carrying that on. That's the ultimate survival. For Nietzsche, it was about power. So power meant a overcoming of one's weaknesses, a stoic discipline, perhaps, that allowed one to achieve certain things he might not have been able to without an adherence to that disposition. Now, this is where we'll be careful, because power is often conceived as evil, but it's not power itself that's evil. It is the use of that power which becomes evil. If an individual achieves ultimate power, the ultimate overcoming of adversity or securing of one's abilities to the highest degree, that can often be quite alluring and quite desirable for other fellows. People with power are gravitating, in a sense, to those without. And it is not the power per se that is the evil part, but it's the individual's decision of which to use that power that can become evil. And so we see that very often in history and even in modern times. If you've ever had a manager who is wielding his position of authority in ways that are authoritarian, if he takes great glee in barking down orders as opposed to uniting a team, which is what he should do, that is a form of a miswielding of power. And that is the evil that very often comes with the connotations of power. And so for Nietzsche, it was all about the individual and how he strived to, how he persevered, how he became more, how he attempted to become more, how he moved about the world and achieved power. Now, for Kaufmann, he makes the claim that power is, you might think only men aim for power. Not so. For females, very often being the wife of someone who's powerful is itself a position of power. Okay, the wife of Albanese is a very powerful woman, even though she's not the prime minister herself. By association, she's a very powerful woman. And a woman who is a mother is in a position of power, power over her infants. And in some cases, a couple of weeks ago, I did a book on homicide. That the mother is the child's, commits infanticide. So, and it's very often the mother that does this, especially in tribal societies. And so that's a unique form of power that's being wielded in certain ways. And so it's not just a male oriented concept. It's just, and so this is what Nietzsche's claim was, it's a universal concept and very often contributes more to the desires of life than the will to live or to survive. And you can think about this conceptually. It's like a rock climber. There was a man, Alex, someone who did the free solo of he just did one recently on a skyscraper, and it was also he free soloed El Capitan, which is a giant mountain in America, I believe, somewhere, and he did that without ropes or harnesses, free soloed the entire mountain. That is not a man who is motivated by the desire to survive. Okay, that is a man seeking power. And I'll re-emphasize, it's not power in the sense of connotations of totalitarianism and authority. It's a power over oneself. It's a mastery over one's experience and one's life. That's what we're really talking about here. And so that man is seeking power, not survival. And anybody indulging in these extreme sports is seeking power. Power for Nietzsche eventually means the destruction of one's neighbor. Now, again, these are very, very harrowing words that he uses. What he meant by it is that a man who achieves ultimate power has the overwhelming envy of his neighbor. The neighbor becomes in awe of the man with power. And so that's what he meant by the destruction of the neighbor. So, very interesting. And the words he used to describe his concepts can very easily be misconstrued. And they're not for the faint heart. Anybody can read him and think, this is a man trying to take over the world. It's not so. He was deeply practical, and he was very cautious of the individual experience, and he was very sorrowful about society's move away from religion that he foresaw and anticipated. But he was also cautious that he didn't want to give too much away. He wanted the readers to really earn what he was saying and the concepts that he was exploring. And so there you have this explicit language like the destruction of the neighbor and the will to power. He talked about masks as a self-deception. Again, in complete anticipation of analytical psychology. The masks we wield, and, you know, whether some people believe it or not, that it originates in Nietzsche, this modern concept of the masks we wield. I did a 1 unit in a business degree a few years ago, and they were talking about this concept about the masks we wield, and all the world was a stage, and very often we hide our true intentions in a business format. And although the philosophy was given in a superficial way because it was a business degree, it was still, steeped in Nietzsche in that sense of like, has a base for philosophy within it. And, Nietzsche was deeply concerned that those masks that we use were very often not only as an external deception, but a self-deception as well. And were a means of hiding our true selves from ourselves, because, what lied beneath was perhaps too traumatic to really bring to the surface. And, I'll give you a very, easy example. Someone who's been at war and they come back with PTSD, and I know the term has been sort of not satirized, but become sort of less weighty than what it used to be. But I'm talking about, real PTSD. Some people who have really done some horrible things, they can't handle it, and they'll turn to drink or drugs because, what they've done is too much for them, and they hide their true selves. They burrow it down and regress and repress all of these emotions that would probably tear them apart if they really started to analyze themselves and look back through their past and attempt to reconcile the things that they've done. Very difficult. And this is the sort of work that Nietzsche was doing at a philosophical level, at a psychological level. And this is why he's the hero of the book, really. For Kaufmann, a lot of these concepts were never explored to the depth that really Nietzsche explored them. And as we'll see, I'm going to read the 3rd volume next week, and it's about Freud. And Kaufmann, discusses, um, Freud's psychology and a lot of it, steeped in Nietzsche. So it's very interesting. Um, if you haven't read him, I recommend him. Start with Beyond Good and Evil. That's a good one. And on the genealogy of morals. Okay, those are two very good books. But they're all good. And there's a lot of secondary, Kaufmann's written a lot of secondary literature on Nietzsche as well, just like this one, which is also quite good. And so these concepts like mass as multiplicity and becoming and protection and reserve as a way of preserving our own experience from interpreters so that they can we don't like people to understand us really. We're always hiding our true intentions, as what Nietzsche claimed anyway. And that self-masking was a way to preserve that integrity. Because if somehow if people really knew the real us, our true selves, the essence of who we were, they wouldn't, they'd be horrified perhaps, or perhaps they just wouldn't like us, or, whatever the case may be for the individual. But we're unified in that sense that these psychological barriers we put up in our interactions serve as a means of distortion that we bring to the world. And it's a very profound thought to have. It's very interesting. And I might have to reread some Nietzsche very shortly, after reading this book, because I've forgotten. It's been a couple of years now. But very interesting. So the last thing I want to talk about with Nietzsche is the conscience. And it's very brief, but he was unhappy with the Christian conception of conscience as a form of self-regulation. And he saw that as a means of resentment, moralistic resentment. And we were continuously within the framework of morality, imposing rules on ourselves, which impeded us. So he was critical of the rules per se and not the concept of the conscience. So he talked about the bad conscience, but he talked about it as an illness, just in the same way the pregnancy is an illness. So you women out there will be able to speak to this a lot better than I can, but the pregnancy is you're feeling a form of discomfort for 9 months. But the result of that is this wonderful bundle of joy, which is a child. Okay. So there's a payoff in the end. So there's this discomfort of having to bear children, and then obviously the pain of childbirth. But then you're met with the ultimate reward, which is the child. And so the conscience, Nietzsche said, was the same way. These regulatory rules only serve as a framework to better your life. And he was concerned we were getting too hung up on the rules themselves, I believe. And so it was turning into more of a pathology where we were using these rules to understand the world instead of just letting them guide our actions in the right way. We were too often bringing these regulatory rules into the structure of our entire experience. And he was critical of that quite severely. And so I'll just briefly mention that. Now, if Nietzsche was the hero of the story, Heidegger was definitely the villain of this book. He was very critical of Heidegger, And Kaufmann knew Heidegger personally, just as well as the third philosopher Buber. He knew them both personally. And he discussed Heidegger's philosophy with him at length um, because he was translating Heidegger. So that's quite interesting. Now, Heidegger was steeped in Kant. He was brought up and raised in the philosophical tradition in Germany, which was Kantian. Now, we know what that means, don't we? It's full of obscurity. And Heidegger's philosophy is notoriously difficult. His main works, which is what Kaufmann criticizes, is Being and Time. And I had to do an assignment on an excerpt from that book, and it's obscure. It's quite challenging. He was talking about technology and as a form of he was trying to he anticipated technology basically as a way of as a net negative on our life, a reliance on it. And he talked about things like tractors and other sorts of industry, replacing labor, and he believed that we were going to be out of a job, basically. It's a very cursory, very broad reading of that excerpt, and that's basically what I remember of it. So he was critical of Being in Time. It's obscure, and he talked about it as he discussed the book as an ontological exploration. That just means about being. Ontology means question of being, question of being the human experience. But it's written in such a way more of an anthropology, an account of human existence rather than being. And a lot of the language was more revolutionary. Heidegger was a Roman Catholic, but a lot of the language he used was secular in nature, and it was authoritarian. He talked about authenticity and inauthenticity in people, and he talked about people in a very derogatory way, often sarcastically in the book. That the way that we, the way we interacted in the world in concepts that he disagreed with was inauthentic, and he was quite sarcastic about how he delivered that. And he he was very authoritarian in how he got it, how he believed he got his point across, how he wanted to be seen. He didn't want any criticism of his book, and he didn't indulge in any self-criticism either. He very much asserted that the book was complete and final, and there was nothing more to be achieved or learnt about it than the book itself. All you had to do was read the book, and all of your problems will be solved. That type of rhetoric. It was supposed to have a part 2, but he never finished it. And Kaufmann describes that in the book that it's because he eventually read Nietzsche, and supposedly Nietzsche undermined a lot of his arguments, especially with regards to human existence and being. And so the book's called Being in Time, and in it he discusses the what it's like to experience time, but it's very narrow, and he discusses it in such a way as his own experience, but he neglects to really philosophize and theorize about how someone of a different age might experience the world, or someone with different experiences. He doesn't bring that up at all. It's just it's philosophized from a very one-dimensional point of view, and Kaufmann's critical of that, very critical, and it's often delivered through the binary of good and evil, and you know, we don't like, well, I don't like using those terms. I was very cautious just a minute ago discussing elements of power as good and evil. Um, it's more complex than that, and good and bad, good and evil, I don't like using those terms. I know that it's very easy to see the world through that framework, and the world seems very complete when understood through that framework, but it's a very dangerous way of thinking. And so, especially when it comes to philosophy and politics, which very often get associated quite closely with philosophy. Um, for example, some policy, um, trying not to be political on this channel. I'll just speak broadly. Some policy gets brought out that has some impact in the world. Say it's a fiscal, let's say fiscal policy instead of a cultural one. Fiscal policy like more tax. Okay, good or bad. Um, Bad if you're the one getting taxed. Good if the person getting taxed is someone you dislike. Okay, so it's a very broad and simplistic view, but that's very broad and simplistic terms we're using, good and evil, right? So you think if some policy comes out, it's good, then the opposite of that must be bad. I don't like using those terms. Does the policy have how much economic net benefit does the policy have? Does the policy generate income to a certain degree in the area it's attempting to? Does the policy achieve what it's set out to achieve within the bounds and the scope of the policy? That's the sort of terms I like to use. And I know that's very theoretical without really concrete examples, but the point is that good and evil um, are very broad and and binary, and it's very often not helpful to use terms like that. And that's how Being and Time is written, very broadly and in very binary terms. And so Kaufmann's main, now he criticizes the book first. He's been very charitable here, but his bias does come through in the end. He's very critical of the book, and he criticizes the book on its own terms. But now, here we go. So Kaufmann was Jewish, and Heidegger was card-carrying Nazi. So you can see where the disdain is coming from, and I'm not trying to be apologetic to one or critical of the other. It's just, that's just how the book is written and it comes through. So Kaufmann was Jewish, Heidegger was a Nazi, and he never, as far as I am aware, he never rescinded that, that, trying to think of the term for someone who's a member of a group. He never rescinded that status. Okay. So he was employed in Berlin. Now, I'm telling you this after, because that's the way it's written in the book. So he criticizes the book on its own terms, and then he talks about the Nazi stuff. And so that he's written it that way, and he talks about it that way because he's trying to be as charitable as possible, which I think is fair given the circumstances. So the fact that he's done that reminds me of that fellow who wrote Man's Search for Me, Viktor Frankl. Very similar in his self-awareness of you know, nobody would have thought any different if they'd been overly critical on the political terms themselves. Everyone would have thought that's very natural. He's being very careful to criticize the book on its own terms, and I applaud him for that. It's very self-aware, and he's been very diligent. Back to the thing. So he Heidegger was Nazi. He was employed at the university by Barmuk, I forget precisely, who was a one of Hitler's generals or associates, or he was a high-ranking member of the Nazi Party, and Heidegger was appointed by him to the university, and he never rescinded his status as a Nazi. Basically, when it all fell over and went to custard, and he carried on. He carried on as a professor there for some years after the fall of the Nazi Party and the fall of Germany. So Kaufmann wasn't too happy about that, which is fair enough. So there you have it. Interestingly, Heidegger they were very, Germany that is, were very cautious to promote or reinforce any academic or cultural ideas that weren't first evaluated by foreign officials. Okay, they were very diligent, and some of that still comes through today. But ironically, they were asking the French for a lot of advice on which ideas were to be allowed to be published and which were not. And the French loved Heidegger. Sartre and who's the Foucault, they very much were in awe of being in time, which is, they were both Marxists, so that's very telling, in my opinion. And a lot of American academics were, they very much, they very easily separated the Nazism from Heidegger and focused purely on his work, being in time. But his work was written in an authoritarian and assertive format, the very same that enabled Hitler to come to power. And I don't know much about the American academics, but the French ones, Foucault and Sartre, they were both Marxists. So that's very interesting. And I'll just leave that with you, however you want to make of that. Heidegger was a Nazi, and the Marxists liked his ideas, and his ideas were written in such a way that were authoritarian and assertive, in the same manner that the Nazi Party were. So I'll just leave it there. The third philosopher he talks about is Martin Buber, and he was a Jewish translator and philosopher, and he took a lot of Buber's self-aware translation philosophy into his own work, and the way he organized his own philosophy was taken a little bit from Buber. So Buber was trying to translate the Old Testament between German and Hebrew, and he talks about specifically the Book of Moses, that he was very cautious to really get at the heart of what the authors were discussing in Moses, and he was very diligent in his means of translating it in a way that really reinforced what the author was trying to say, rather than perhaps the most charitable or easy format. Apparently, I don't know if this is still true today, but apparently Kaufmann writes in the book that publishers very often employed and commissioned translators on the basis of their ability to translate in a way that the consumer was more able to understand, rather than on the means of what the author was really trying to get at the heart at. So what the author was really trying to say. So that's very interesting. I didn't know that about translation work. So it might be very interesting to read a book on translation one day, and about how that what that process involves. That'd be quite interesting for me, I think, after reading this book and hearing a bit about that. So he was very diligent in his means of translation. And Kaufmann took that on when he translated a lot of German philosophers. And he did, he took great pain to really understand what their lives were like and try to get at the heart of what they were really getting at. And to be able to translate that into English was, we're very thankful to have him as a translator. He also wrote a book, Buber, that is called I and Thou, which I'm also very interested in reading. So I read a book, and there are some things in there, and it's led me to want to read more books related to the things. That's how it should be. That's very much how it should be. That's the beauty of nonfiction. That's the beauty of philosophy, is the good philosophy anyway. Not too narrow and broad enough that it introduces you to new ideas and new topics that make you curious and make you sort of vying after more. You know, man's search for more. That's what it's all about. So that's what's very much happened for me. He wrote a book called I and Thou, and it's about how it wasn't received very well apparently, but I'm still interested in reading it. It's about how the the object, the individual that a person is interacting with becomes an object of experience rather than engaging meaningfully with that person. And so I don't know if anyone's ever been in a conversation where uh, someone's talking to you, but it doesn't really matter that it's you that they're talking to. They're speaking in such a way that it could be anybody. It doesn't really matter that it's you, the individual. Say for me, my name's Daniel. It doesn't really matter that it's me, Daniel, that the person's talking to. They're just talking and going on about, whatever it is, and it could be anybody. It could be Joe or Jim or Jeffrey or Dan or Drake or John. It could be anybody. But they're speaking in that way nonetheless. That's what arose for me as I was reading that part about it, the I and thou. So apparently he talks a little bit about that and about how the human experience can very much objectify the attention of that experience, the direction that that action is orientated towards. So I don't know if I'm explaining that very well, but um, there you have it. So that's the I and thou. People and the way that they experience the world and the way that they interact with others and those others as a form of object rather than subject. So he talks briefly about that. Wasn't received very well. He's often overlooked, but generally I found that means that it's probably quite good. The philosophers that I have been most drawn to have not been the famous ones, apart from Nietzsche, of course. But very often it's the ones that are quite sensible and their insights are, they're not only more easy to understand, but their insights are often far more acute. They're more precise. And that's very interesting. So I'm always on the lookout for people that I've never heard of because those are the people I want to be reading, not the famous ones. The famous ones have always got the famous ideas and everyone's heard of them, especially if you're interested in this sort of stuff. You would have heard of Heidegger and Sartre and Foucault and Kant, and they're all very famous and everyone's done great work on them, and it's all rather boring to me. I'd rather look at people like Kaufmann, who's spends his entire life researching the biographies of other philosophers so that he can better understand their philosophy. That's incredible. So to be able to read this book has been a great pleasure. So there you have it. We're going to read volume 3. I don't have it in hard copy. It's out of the library. Someone's got it, the buggers. But I'm going to find it online, I'm sure, and read it over the next week. So volume 3, I didn't know whether I was going to do it, but I decided to. I may as well finish it off. I've gotten this far. I've gotten 2/3 of the way through it. I may as well finish it off. So we'll do that next week. It's about Freud, Jung, and Adler, and that's the final volume. So hopefully this week's been semi-enjoyable for you. It's a very interesting book. It's very, I keep forgetting the word I like to use to discuss the books that are very easy to understand. They're approachable. Thank you. That's what it was. They're very approachable, these books. They're very easy to understand, and he discusses very interesting topics in very easy to understand ways. So that's very good. So there you go. Thank you very much.